Hey, thanks so much for coming. So my name is Joanmarie Del Vecchio. I am a postdoctoral fellow at Dartmouth College. I'm a postdoc in the Newcomb Institute for Computational Studies. My research is interdisciplinary with a computational theme, so it's no surprise that I'm very excited to use some of the tools that Earth Engine supports me as I document Arctic landscape change. So I am a geomorphologist. I'm someone who studies how landscapes look and change, and I'm interested in the physics underlying the processes that shape the landscape and allow us to make predictions about how the landscape will change in the future. In particular, I'm interested in how climate forces like vegetation, like a map of vegetation I'm showing you in North America up here, and in particular, I ask questions about landscape change in permafrost landscapes. I care about permafrost landscapes because they contain almost 3 times as much carbon as in the atmosphere, but the high latitudes are also experiencing amplified warming. And so these permafrost carbon stocks are very potentially vulnerable to erosion, to exposure, and that carbon will end up in our atmosphere. So I am a part of a team of earth scientists and geomorphologists who are trying to document landscape change. And some of that involves going to the field and making measurements of how the topography is changing. We take samples of soil to quantify the carbon in it to make predictions about where that carbon is going to end up in the future. But obviously, this is a hard process to scale up because the Arctic is quite vast, but we can only dig so many holes. And so I want to leverage what we can with Earth Engine and other sorts of remote sensing capabilities to quantify what we measure in the field and scale it up to a pan-Arctic setting. But quickly, I'm going to give you a quick geomorphology lesson. So for folks who aren't familiar, this is a source-to-sink system here where sediment is produced in the headwaters where streams are narrow and steep. And down at the sink where sediment is deposited, streams are wide and gentle. And folks who have been working in sink land and wide river land have had, decades of Landsat data that is at a resolution with which we can understand the mechanics operating on the landscape. Of course, this is a time lapse made with Google Earth Engine. But for me, for people who work in the headwaters and in steep landscapes and in the soil-mantled hill slopes, a lot of our data has been pretty low quality for a while. We've relied on hand-surveyed maps that in the early 2000s got digitized, and so we can start to do digital work on 10-meter resolution data. And then recently with airborne LiDAR, we're starting to see better and better data sets so we can start to make connections about the processes that are shaping this landscape to a granular degree that helps us understand the physics. But it's really hard to fly planes across the Arctic, so we even have the ability to use tandem satellites that generate photogrammetric models of the elevation surfaces of the Arctic and the Antarctic. So this is where I have to say, okay, everybody, you get your finger, hold it up to your eyes. You close one eyeball, you close the other eyeball. Your finger is moving because your perspective is changing and you're creating depth, right? And so basically we have the ability to crunch through a bunch of satellite images to create digital elevation models at very high resolution for the Arctic and the Antarctic landscapes that we otherwise wouldn't have data sets for. So this is the Polar Geospatial Center's Arctic DEM product, which is another product that is available on Earth Engine, so anybody can explore the Arctic. And another way that we can start to characterize otherwise inaccessible landscapes is we can use some of the satellite data that comes from satellites like Sentinel-2 that have multispectral imagery. So not just what we can see with our eyes, but we can start to sense remotely temperature, moisture, and vegetation trends. And so this is a time lapse I made on Earth Engine of a floodplain in the Arctic wetting and drying over the course of the summer, where the yellower colors are wetter indices and the blues yellow is drier, blue is wetter. So I'm very excited for this data revolution for process geomorphology. We're going to be able to test geomorphic ideas with objective and quantifiable metrics using large data sets. We can observe vulnerable landscapes with the frequency and detail we need to predict their futures. And finally, we can broaden what it means to be a geomorphologist in the future. So let me just present to you a little conundrum from the research that I do. There is an existing hypothesis. There's sort of like a physical understanding for the extent of a drainage network or channels, the density of channels in permafrost landscapes. And some of the prevailing wisdom is that there would be fewer channels in a permafrost landscape compared to landscapes that aren't underlain by frozen soil, because there's only so much space under a hill slope to store water, so that water has to daylight or come out at a higher point on the hill slope. And that means that we should expect larger channel networks where we have permafrost. However, I have seen from my field observations that there are active landscape processes in thawing permafrost landscapes that seem to be extending the channel networks. And so this is a little bit of a conundrum. I mean, maybe it's a problem of time scale, of spatial scale, but we need the data in order to figure out how the extent of the permafrost is going to change where we have channels and some of these processes that we expect to erode the landscape. The problem is the last time anyone's really taken a process geomorphology view at this happened in 1999 using 1999 data. But luckily, this is 2022, we have the technology, right? We have the ability to ask this question at a large scale, but with the detail that we need. And so I'm going to demonstrate how I use Earth Engine and a couple of other Python tools to ask this question. So what I do is I use a lot of Earth Engine-based data sets to do these analyses. So what I asked Google to do is give me every headwater watershed in the Northern Hemisphere. And so this is the Hydrosheds level 10 watershed. This is a relatively small sized watershed delineation from a global sort of hydrologic data set. And I said, okay, only give me headwater watersheds and only give me watersheds with a vegetation index above 0.6. And that tells me that there's enough plants, we're soil mantled, we're talking about landscapes in which the diffusion of sediment and the advection of the channels are going to be competing, the processes I'm interested in. And so I extract important climate metrics to those watersheds. I get the mean annual temperature, precipitation. I get the relief of those watersheds, so the maximum and minimum elevation, extracted from elevation data that's also hosted on Earth Engine. And I calculate drainage density via a hydrologic data set called the Merit Hydro data set. And this is a global map of flow accumulation. So this is like the volume of water that flows into a pixel on the Earth's surface. What I do is I count the percent of total watershed pixels that are above this threshold, this 0.1 square kilometers, which is basically a drainage area that represents stream processes. And what I do is I take that and I intersect that data with permafrost information and past glacial extent information. So this is what that data looks like. I ended up with over 67,000 watersheds, and I've colored these points by the extent of the permafrost. So the coldest continuous permafrost going into less extensive permafrost where it's warmer, and then the gray points are no permafrost. So drainage density of these points looks like this. We've got, clearly there is spatial variability in that drainage density. When we zoom in, this is what that data set looks like. So on the left here, this is that Merit Hydro, basically that threshold drainage area. And you might be a little bit perturbed by it looks a little stretched. So this is from the Earth Engine map viewer, which is in a pseudo Mercator projection, which is why at the poles that data looks stretched, but the data itself is fine. Versus in West Virginia here, you can see those river pixels appear to be, at a first glance, there's a lot more pixels on the right versus the left, even though we're at the same zoom level. And so what that data looks like, I wanted to take a big view of it and put it all in a big summary figure here. So I calculated the ratio of permafrost drainage density to non-permafrost drainage density. And I wanted to compare my data. I wanted to compare apples to apples with my data. And so I've binned my data by relief and mean annual precipitation. So the x-axis there is that relief, that high versus low elevation. And I wanted this to act as a proxy for the steepness of the watersheds, maybe tectonics uplift or causing some watersheds to be steeper or less steep. So I wanted to make sure I compared them all correctly. And then on the y-axis is mean annual precipitation. And this is just volume of water, right? For a given volume of water, what is that water doing to that landscape? So you're going to see data, and I've colored this data by the ratio of drainage density in these two areas. So the green boxes, if you see a green color, it means there are fewer streams in non-permafrost watersheds. And if you see a purple color, you're just going to see fewer streams in permafrost watersheds. So what do you all think? What's your prediction? What colors are you going to see? Think about it. All right, have an idea in your mind? Wow, that's a lot of purple. There you go. And not only is it a lot of purple, but it's a lot of purple that is statistically significant. So we can kind of say, you know, very, very strongly that permafrost watersheds appear to have fewer streams than their temperate counterparts. We've learned something new about how the Arctic works from this, you know, these couple of data sets that have been hosted on Earth Engine. And, you know, just to sort of drive this point home, I said, oh boy, maybe glacial history is also influencing this, right? So in the northern latitudes, maybe the past glaciers have shaped the landscape and have affected drainage density. But when I break out my data by what they've been glaciated in the past, I see the same pattern where the more extensive permafrost you have, the lower the drainage density, regardless of glacial history. So that's pretty cool too. So when I break this data out by the temperature, I plotted the permafrost and non-permafrost data. So the permafrost is in blue, the non-permafrost is in red. And interestingly, in both scenarios, we have lower drainage densities associated with colder temperatures. And I'm like, all right, let's dig into this a little bit more. So what I did was I regressed mean annual temperature on the x-axis against mean annual precipitation on the y-axis, and I calculated the residuals of these data. So I was finding particularly wet or particularly dry watersheds given their temperature. And that data tells me a slightly more nuanced picture. So down in the right with that red data, this is in non-permafrost landscapes. So relatively wet non-permafrost watersheds have lower drainage density. And this is exciting because this is a result that has been seen using other data sets, using other like geomorphic metrics for drainage density, right? So these are two different approaches that end up having the same answer. And so what we're looking at here is in arid and semi-arid landscapes, if it rains more, there's more vegetation. That vegetation does a good job of holding sediment to the hill slope, and that drainage density tends to go down. It is interesting then that in permafrost watersheds, the trend is opposite. More water in a system creates more drainage density in permafrost landscapes, which is interesting. And the relationship is a little less tight. And so this analysis has given me a new and interesting perspective with which to interrogate this data. And so I'm starting to dig into like, well, what are the processes that are creating this different response in a permafrost landscape versus a non-permafrost landscape. So one of the peculiar aspects of a permafrost watershed are these features called water tracks. So water tracks are preferential flow paths that basically take the place of lower order channels that seem to exist in permafrost landscapes, but not in non-permafrost landscapes. So these are these like parallel to subparallel, big streaky flow paths that go all the way from the ridgeline down to some of the higher order channels. And what these flow paths are doing is they're flowing on top of the active layer, right? The thawed top on top of the frozen permafrost. And my hypothesis is that these features are really good at disseminating flow across a hill slope and keeping the drainage density low because it's not carving channels, right? This is a flow path that is taking water and moving it from the top of the hill slope down to the toe of the hill slope and down to the higher order channels without necessarily carving a valley and starting to create streams that have really high drainage area associated with them. So I spent some time mapping water tracks, and I did about 400 square kilometers in an hour, and I got very proud of myself for that, except that means that you're spending 2 years constantly mapping the entire Arctic to find the presence or absence of water tracks, because we want to know where these things are in order to test the hypothesis that these features are what are creating the lower drainage densities in permafrost landscapes. So I'm trying to use a computer to do this. I'm not trying to sit down and map all these water tracks, right? So part of what I'm doing with this video that will not play, that's fine. Oh, we got it. Cool. Okay, we got the video to play. Okay, so part of what I'm doing is I'm using Earth Engine to streamline the process of finding imagery that I can use to map water tracks on. And I particularly wanted to make the process easy for undergraduates that work for me, right? I didn't want to have like undergraduates need to know a bunch of code and a bunch of ways to like need to query data. So I use Earth Engine to streamline the process. And what I do is for a given watershed boundary, I bring up a lot of imagery from the growing season, which is when we can try to find the best imagery to label for water tracks. And so you can see I'm demonstrating that in this pull down menu, I say, okay, you have a choice of dates that you can pick. And I say, okay, why don't we use the June 23rd date, because there's not a lot of snow, but it is, easy to see the vegetation come out. And it also creates things like vegetation indices that also highlight the presence of these flow paths. And what I do is when I take this data and we bring it off of Earth Engine, we actually bring it into, here's a pluggable for you. I bring it into image segmentation software written by some folks at the US Geologic Survey, Dan Buscombe and Em Goldstein, who have written an open source image classification software that me and my students are working with in order to more efficiently map water tracks across the Arctic using machine learning algorithms. But of course, Earth Engine has its own built-in classifiers. So I decided to experiment with using labeled data that I got from the image segmentation software that I was using. I brought it into Earth Engine, and I ran just honestly a very simple card classifier. This is like super out of the box, but I was really impressed with the results. So the blue is telling you where I labeled water tracks on the labeled data, and the red is telling you where there wasn't water tracks on the labeled data. And I sort of trained it on the training data, and I gave it, an area of northern Alaska on the North Slope to just give it a check. And I'm actually fairly impressed with the results, but this was like last week. So, I haven't thought about it more than this, but it's cool. It's a cool thing that you can do with some of the stuff built into Earth Engine. And I'm really excited about this because this is these sort of computational remote sensing approaches are going to be a way that we can expand what it means to be a geomorphologist. What does geomorphologist look like, right? Like, we are all people who can collect data. There's no physical limitation to the collection of this geomorphic data. That makes it a more inviting field for folks who otherwise may have been excluded from doing field work or other physical-based data collection. It facilitates investigations centered on climate change and environmental justice questions, which also might contribute to a broader group of people being interested in studying surface processes. And it also teaches transferable skills for a growing job market, right? If you're teaching students how to work with large data sets, to manipulate data in a coding environment, not only are they learning a lot about science, but they're also getting ready to do a wide variety of jobs after graduation. And so to just summarize for you here, we have better data, better computers, better algorithms that are helping us understand landscapes, and in particular in remote places where like permafrost landscapes are, the sort of remote characterization is going to be the rule rather than the exception. And this is exciting for me. It's kind of leading to what I'd like to think of as the democratization of permafrost landscape data and computational tools, right? Anyone is capable of studying these landscapes as long as they have the ability to access the data and manipulate it with code. So this is my contact information. I'd love to talk to you more about this. And in particular, I welcome you just in a couple of hours. I'm going to do a presentation about my education applications to some of this coding. And then tomorrow morning, I have a poster for presenting my science data. But I'd love to take your questions right now. That's a great question. So the question was cloud masking. So yes, I run a very typical out of the box Sentinel-2 cloud filter as well as mask, but you are totally correct in that there's a lot of low clouds and haze. So that's why it was very important for me to have a human look at the imagery that I was using, in addition to the fact that we're trying to capture senescence, or when the leaves start getting greener, because that's when you can see the water tracks best. The algorithms that are currently there to filter clouds are not quite good enough for our purposes. And so there is a human bottleneck at the imagery selection that I'm trying to smooth out the friction for, but you're right that clouds are also a tough thing. And snow. Snow's a hard one too. Any last thing that I would like to share? I guess I was sort of before I came here, I was sort of reflecting on how in December of 2020, I was writing a proposal to do this postdoc, and I said, boy, wouldn't it be cool if I knew enough about computers to do the things that I'm proposing to do? And it is very exciting to know that for a lot of these computational and code-based tools, there's a lot of resources online, right? Like I always joke with people, like there's no Stack Exchange for your mass spec, right? But like you can always usually find resources online, and it's a very exciting branch of earth science where like you can collect as much data as you feel like writing puzzles and algorithms for. And I think that's a cool thing. I mean, nothing beats hiking around the field, but like this is pretty cool too.